Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. The Canaanites lived crushed between the millstones of mighty empires, the Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the east, the Hittites to the north. They controlled a strip of land barely 50 miles wide in most places. They had no vast river valley, no endless steppes, no gold mines. What they had was position, ingenuity, and a desperate need to survive. And from that desperation came innovations that would outlive every empire that ever threatened them. Tonight, we will journey to the land of purple and cedar, where the first alphabets were carved into stone, where gods battled primordial seas, and where merchant princes built trading networks that spanned from Britain to India. We'll walk through cities that stood for 3,000 years, decode diplomatic letters between frightened kings and distant pharaohs, and witness the catastrophic collapse that scattered the Canaanites across the known world, a scattering that would spread their revolutionary ideas to every corner of Crosspa, the Mediterranean, and beyond. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel time's current reversing, pulling you gently into the Middle Bronze Age, around 3,500 years ago, where the morning sun rises over a land trapped between the Mediterranean Sea and the Lebanon Mountains, where cedar forests cascade down limestone cliffs toward beaches stained purple with crushed shells, and where the very air tastes of salt and resin and possibility. The geography of Canaan was both its blessing and its curse. Imagine a narrow corridor, rarely more than 50 miles wide, pressed between the vast blue of the Mediterranean and the harsh bronze of the desert. To the north, the snow-capped peaks of Mount Lebanon rose like white-crowned giants, their slopes thick with the cedar forests that would become more valuable than gold. To the south, the land gradually flattened into coastal plains and then disappeared into the vastness of the Sinai, that bridge between continents, where so much history would be written. This was not a land that naturally gave birth to empire. Unlike Egypt with its Nile, or Mesopotamia with its twin rivers, Canaan had only seasonal streams and uncertain rains. Unlike the vast grasslands that produced the horse cultures of the steppes, or the mineral-rich mountains that gave other civilizations their wealth, Canaan seemed to possess only what others might consider scraps, a handful of good harbours, some productive coastal plains, forests that others coveted, and location, always location. But perhaps that was the secret. The Canaanites couldn't retreat into splendid isolation like Egypt behind its deserts. They couldn't dominate through sheer territorial mass, like the Assyrians would later do. They had to be clever, they had to be adaptable, they had to take what little they had and transform it into something the world had never seen before. Consider the murex shell, that humble sea snail clinging to the rocks along the Phoenician coast. Thousands of other coastal peoples had seen these creatures, had perhaps even eaten them, had certainly stepped on their shells while fishing. But the Canaanites saw something else. They saw how the snail, when threatened, released a clear liquid that turned purple in the sunday. They saw how this purple didn't fade like berry dyes or plant colours. They saw possibility in what others overlooked. Or consider their position between empires. Where others might have seen only danger, and there was certainly danger, the Canaanites saw opportunity. Every army that marched through their land, every diplomatic embassy that stopped in their cities, every merchant caravan that used their roads, and yes, all of these were chances to learn, to adapt, to profit, to survive. They became the ultimate intermediaries, not because they chose to be, but because geography gave them no other choice. The first purple dawn. You wake before sunrise on the beaches south of Tyre, your feet already wet from the retreating tide. The Mediterranean is still dark, almost black in the pre-dawn hour, but you know these waters, know their moods and their gifts. In your hand is a bronze tool, curved like a hook but stronger, designed for prying. Your grandfather's grandfather made tools just like this one, passed down the knowledge of where to look, when to harvest, how to see value where others see only slime and shell. The rocks are slippery beneath your bare feet, covered in that particular combination of algae and salt that makes every step a calculated risk. But you've been doing this since you were 7 years old, when your mother first brought you here, showed you the secret. Look, she had said, pointing to a cluster of shells that looked identical to all the others. But really look, and now you see them everywhere. The murex shells, some no bigger than your thumb, others the size of your fist. Hexaplex trunculus, though you don't call them that. To you, they're simply the source, the beginning of a process that will transform these humble creatures into something worth more than gold, more than silver, more than all the cedar wood in Lebanon. You pry one loose, feeling the creature inside retract, feeling it release its defense. Anais, that clear liquid that means nothing now, but will mean everything soon. You drop it into your basket, the bronze tool already working on the next shell. By the time the sun breaks the horizon, you'll have hundreds. By the time the sun reaches its peak, these hundreds will have become a tiny amount of pure purple dye, enough to colour a single small cloth that will sell for what a farmer makes in a year. The smell hits you as you work, that distinctive stench of rotting shellfish that marks every purple dyer's workshop, every purple dyer's clothes, every purple dyer's children. It's the smell of prosperity and revulsion combined. The price of beauty, your city reeks of it. Foreign visitors hold cloths to their noses. But they still come, still pay, still wrap themselves in the purple that declares their status to the world. As the sunrise finally breaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, you pause in your harvesting to watch. The light transforms the water from black to deep blue to something that almost matches the purple you're trying to create. This is the moment your mother loved best, when the natural world seemed to be teaching you the very colours you were trying to capture. The gods show us beauty, she would say, and we just try to hold on to it a little longer. Cities rising from stone. The first cities of Canaan rose from the earth like prayers made solid, their walls built not from imperial decree, but from the collective will of communities that understood survival meant cooperation. Jericho was already ancient when the pyramids were young, its springs creating an oasis that had drawn humans for thousands of years before the first stone was laid upon another. By 3000 BC, it had already been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that its earlier incarnations were literally the foundations for its later ones, creating those distinctive tells, the artificial hills made of compressed history that dot the Levantine landscape. But Jericho was an anomaly, an inland city that prospered because of its springs and its position controlling trade routes through the Jordan Valley. The real character of Canaanite civilization emerged along the coast in cities like Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and Acre. These were cities that looked outward from the very beginning, cities whose harbours were more important than their walls, whose merchants were more valuable than their soldiers. Byblos may have been the most important of all in these early centuries, though each city would claim precedence in its own legends. The Egyptians called it Kubna, and then Gebal, and they had been trading with it since before the first dynasty. The city's name would eventually become synonymous with papyrus, the Greek word biblos, and from that would come Bible, the book, the very concept of written knowledge passed down through generations. How fitting that a Canaanite city would give its name to the technology of writing itself. The archaeological layers of Byblos read like a textbook of human development. In the lowest levels, dating back 7,000 years, we find simple fishing villages, their inhabitants living in round huts, their tools made of flint and bone. Move up through the layers, and you can watch civilization emerging. The huts become rectangular houses. The houses cluster into neighborhoods. The neighborhoods require walls. The walls require organization. Organization requires leadership. Leadership requires legitimacy. Legitimacy requires temples. Temples require priests. Priests require writing to keep track of offerings and obligations. By 2500 BC, Byblos had become something remarkable, a fully developed city-state with monumental architecture, sophisticated crafts workshops, and most importantly, a thriving international trade. The famous Byblos ships, their cedar hulls sealed with bitumen, their purple sails catching the Mediterranean winds, were already legendary. These vessels could carry tons of cargo, cedar logs for Egyptian temples, wine and oil in ceramic amphorae, worked metal from Cyprus, ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan. The city's temple district dominated the skyline, multiple sanctuaries dedicated to the Baalat Gebal, the Lady of Byblos, whom the Egyptians identified with their goddess Hathor. The temple complexes weren't just religious centers, but economic ones as well. Here, international contracts were witnessed by the gods, disputes were settled by divine judgment, and wealth was stored in sacred treasuries that no thief would dare rob. The priests were bankers, judges, and diplomats, all in one. Their authority derived from their ability to communicate with both gods and foreign powers. Yet for all their sophistication, these early Canaanite cities maintained something essentially human in their scale. Unlike the vast urban sprawls of Mesopotamia or the planned administrative centers of Egypt, Canaanite cities grew organically, shaped by topography and trade, rather than imperial design. Their streets wound up hillsides, following ancient paths, their houses clustered around extended family courtyards. Their workshops opened directly onto busy market streets, where the sound of hammering bronze competed with merchants, hawking their wares in a dozen different languages. The houses themselves tell us about daily life in ways that monuments never could. Most were simple structures, 2 or 3 rooms built around a central courtyard, where cooking was done and animals were kept. The floors were beaten, earth covered with reed mats. The walls were mud brick covered with plaster, sometimes painted with simple geometric designs or scenes from daily life. But even in these modest homes, archaeologists find evidence of international trade. An Egyptian scarab here, a Mycenaean pottery shard there, a cylinder seal from Mesopotamia tucked into a wall niche, the breathing space of morning markets. The morning market in any Canaanite city was a gentler affair than the aggressive commerce of midday, before the sun climbed high enough to make the stone streets painful to walk on. Before the serious merchants arrived with their scales and their sharp bargaining voices, there was this quiet hour when the city fed itself. Women arrived first, carrying baskets on their hips, their children still sleepy-eyed trailing behind. The bread sellers had been up since midnight, their ovens turning out flat rounds of bread that filled the air with a comforting smell of baked grain. The milk vendors brought their goats right into the market, milking them fresh for customers who brought their own bowls. There was something deeply reassuring about the sound of milk hitting ceramic, about the warmth of it, about the foam that settled on top like morning clouds. The fruit sellers arranged their products like artists, pyramids of pomegranates whose red skin caught the early light, clusters of grapes still dewed from the vineyard, figs split open to show their seed-studded hearts. Each vendor had their spot, inherited through generations, defended through tradition rather than law. The date seller's corner, the olive merchant's table, the honey woman's jars, all in their appointed places, as reliable as sunrise itself. Children darted between the stalls, sometimes on errands, sometimes simply playing in that way. Children always have in markets, turning commerce into adventure. A boy might earn a few dried figs for carrying an elderly woman's purchases. A girl might trade songs for snippets of bread, her voice clear and high in the morning air, singing old songs about rain and harvest and the gods' blessings. The conversation was soft, neighbourly, concerned with the small dramas of daily life. A new baby born to the potter's family, the old priest's illness, and who would perform the morning offerings if he couldn't rise from his bed, the state of the olive harvest, and whether this year's oil would be as golden as last year's. These weren't the conversations of historical significance, but they were the conversations that made life bearable, that wove communities together one small thread at a time. Letters in clay and sound. The revolution began not with armies or kings, but with a few scratches in stone, made by miners or soldiers, we're not entirely certain which, in the turquoise mines of Serebit el-Qadim, in the Sinai Peninsula. Somewhere around 1800 BC, someone looked at the elaborate hieroglyphic system of the Egyptians, those hundreds of complex symbols that took years to master, and thought, there must be an easier way. And there was. Instead of using symbols to represent ideas or whole words, why not use them to represent sounds? Not all the sounds, not the complex vocalization that makes human speech so varied, but just the consonants, the bones of words that carry their essential meaning. 22 symbols. That's all. 22 symbols that could be learned in days instead of years, that could be written quickly on pottery shards or papyrus, that could be adapted to any language that used similar sounds. We call it Proto-Sinaitic script when we find it in the Sinai, Proto-Canaanite when we find it in the Levant proper, but it's the same revolutionary idea, spreading like fire through dry grass. The earliest examples are crude, uncertain, the work of people experimenting with something that had never existed before. But by 1500 BC, the scribes of Ugarit had developed this concept into a sophisticated system. Though they chose to write it in cuneiform wedges, pressed into clay, rather than the linear letters that would later become standard. The Ugaritic alphabet gives us our first clear view of how this system worked. Each symbol had a name that started with the sound it represented. Aleph for the glottal stop, named after the ox whose head the symbol resembled. Bet for the bay sound, named after the house it pictured. Gimel for gay, possibly from a throwing stick or camel. These weren't arbitrary marks, but simplified pictures that helped memory, though they would become increasingly abstract as centuries passed and writing speed became more important than pictorial clarity. Consider what this meant for a merchant preparing a shipment of goods. In the Egyptian or Mesopotamian systems, he would need a professional scribe, someone who had spent years learning hundreds or thousands of symbols. The scribe was a gatekeeper of literacy, a professional whose rare skills made him indispensable and expensive. But with the alphabet, that same merchant could teach his son the basics in a few weeks. A bright child could be writing simple inventories within a month, contracts within a year. The democratization of writing was perhaps the most radical revolution in human history, though it happened so slowly that no one at the time could have grasped its full implications. When writing was the preserve of a tiny elite, knowledge itself was controllable, limited, hierarchical. But when any moderately intelligent person could learn to read and write, the entire structure of how information moved through society changed. We can see this transformation in the archives of Ugarit, that great coastal city that flourished in the centuries before the Bronze Age collapse. The royal palace contained thousands of tablets, but these weren't all the work of royal scribes. There were letters from merchants, contracts between traders, personal correspondence between family members, even what appears to be school exercises, where students practiced writing the alphabet over and over, sometimes adding little doodles or personal messages in the margins. The most extraordinary discovery was the Library of the High Priest, which contained the great mythological texts of Canaanite religion, written in this new alphabetic script. The Baal cycle, the legend of Keret, the tale of Akut, Yero S. These weren't simple religious texts, but sophisticated literature, with complex wordplay, parallel structures, and poetic devices that show a culture fully embracing the possibilities of written language. The scribes who wrote these texts weren't just recording oral traditions, they were creating something new, using the technology of writing to craft narratives that could never have existed in purely oral form. But the alphabet's greatest triumph was its adaptability. When the Phoenicians carried it westward in their ships, the Greeks adapted it, adding symbols for vowels. When the Greeks colonized Italy, the Etruscans borrowed it, and from them the Romans created the letters that wrote this script. Eastward, it became the ancestor of Aramaic, and from Aramaic came Hebrew and Arabic. Southward, it influenced the scripts of Ethiopia, the 22 symbols invented by some unknown Canaanite genius became the ancestors of almost every alphabet on Earth. The implications rippled outward through time, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Laws could be written down for all to see, not hidden in the memories of elite judges. Stories could travel without storytellers. Knowledge could accumulate across generations without the inevitable distortions of oral transmission. Philosophy, science, literature, all the intellectual achievements we associate with civilization, became possible because someone in ancient Canaan thought there must be an easier way to write. The merchant's daughter. Her name was Arishat, and she was born into purple, and Hello 40 self, not wearing it, for that was forbidden to all but royalty, but making it, selling it, understanding its value better than she understood her own worth. Her father owned 3 ships that sailed the triangle route: cedar to Egypt, gold back to Tyre, purple cloth to whoever could afford it along the way. She learned mathematics before she learned to cook, could calculate exchange rates between Egyptian deben, Mesopotamian shekels, and Cypriot talents before she could weave cloth. Her father, having no sons that survived past infancy, poured all his knowledge into her keen mind, though both of them knew she could never officially inherit his business. That would go to whatever husband her father chose. But if she was clever, and Arishat was very clever, she could be the power behind the contract. At 14, she accompanied her father on her first voyage to Egypt. The journey took 12 days, hugging the coast, stopping each night at familiar harbours where her father had contacts, where safety could be purchased with gifts and old friendships, honoured with wine shared under the stars. She watched everything: how the sailors read the winds, how her father negotiated with harbour masters, how certain phrases in Egyptian could mean the difference between profit and loss. In Memphis, she saw the pyramids for the first time, those impossible mountains of stone that made even her proud father go quiet with awe. But what impressed her more was the Egyptian bureaucracy, the endless records, the scribes who documented everything. This is power, her father told her, but it's also weakness. They must record everything because they trust nothing. We Canaanites, we trust relationships. A man's word, properly given, is worth more than all the papyrus in Egypt. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that the Egyptians had discovered something important with their obsessive documentation, but she was 14 and knew when to keep her thoughts to herself. Instead, she watched and learned, memorizing the faces of the Egyptian officials who could be bribed and those who couldn't, noting which translators added their own spin to negotiations, understanding that in the space between languages lay opportunity for those quick enough to grasp it. On the journey home, their ship was followed by pirates, desperate men in a stolen fishing vessel who thought a merchant ship might be an easy target. Her father ordered the crew to prepare for defense, but Arishat had a different idea. They're hungry, she told her father. Look at their sail. It's patched with 3 different cloths. They're not professional pirates. They're fishermen who've lost everything. Her father listened, because he had learned to trust his daughter's observations. Instead of fighting, they threw over a bag of grain and 2 amphorae of oil, enough to feed the pirates' families for a month. The pirates took the offering and disappeared into a hidden cove, and her father's ship sailed on unharmed. That night, her father sat with her under the stars and spoke honestly for perhaps the first time. "You should have been born a son," he said, and she heard both compliment and sorrow in his voice. "The business should be yours by right." She could have been bitter, but bitterness was a luxury merchants couldn't afford. "Then help me choose a husband who will listen," she said. "Someone intelligent enough to know good advice when he hears it, but not so proud that he won't take it from a woman." Her father laughed, the sound carrying across the dark water. "Such men are rarer than perfect pearls," he said. "But for you, my daughter, I will find one." When gods walked in gardens, the Canaanite gods were not distant abstractions, dwelling in some unreachable heaven. They lived on Mount Safon, the mountain we now call Jebel Akra, on the Turkish-Syrian border, close enough that on clear days you could see clouds gathering around its peak and know the gods were in council. They quarrelled and loved, fought and feasted, died and were reborn in cycles that matched the agricultural seasons that governed human survival. At the head of the pantheon sat El, the father god, ancient and wise, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, always inscrutable. He was the god of decisions that could not be appealed, of judgments that stood for eternity. His wife Asherah, mother of the gods, was worshipped in sacred groves, where wooden poles called Asherim stood among living trees, creating spaces where the divine feminine could be encountered in the rustling of leaves and the play of dappled sunlight. But if El was the distant father, Baal was the son who fought for humanity. His very name meant Lord or Master, and he was master of the storm, bringer of rain, fighter of cosmic battles that determined whether humans would feast or starve. The Baal cycle, preserved in those precious tablets from Ugarit, tells his story in poetry that still has the power to move us 3,000 years later. The cycle begins with Baal's battle against Yam, the god of the sea and chaos. Yam demands kingship over the gods, and El, in his inscrutability, agrees. But Baal refuses to submit. With weapons crafted by the craftsman god Kothar wa Cassis, clubs named Driver and Chaser, Baal defeats Yam in single combat, establishing his right to rule. The story resonates with every small nation that ever had to fight against seemingly overwhelming odds. Every David facing a Goliath, every Canaan facing an Egypt. Then comes Mot, death itself, the dry power of drought and desert that threatened Canaan every summer. Baal descends into Mot's throat, into the underworld, and all fertility dies with him. The earth cracks, the crops wither, humanity faces extinction. But Anat, Baal's sister and perhaps lover, the warrior goddess whose violence in battle was legendary, goes searching for him. She finds Mot and does what no other god dared. She seizes death himself, splits him with a sword, winnows him with a winnowing fork, burns him with fire, grinds him with millstones, and scatters him in the fields. Its agricultural imagery turned into cosmic violence, the harvest becoming a harvesting of death itself. Baal returns, as he must, as the rains must return each autumn, and his return is celebrated with 7 years of plenty. The cycle would repeat, as it always did, death and rebirth, drought and rain, the eternal dance that defined agricultural life in a land where rainfall was never certain. These weren't simple nature allegories, though they certainly functioned as such. They were sophisticated theological statements about the nature of reality. The Canaanites understood that life required death, that fertility demanded sacrifice, that chaos was always waiting at the borders of order. Their gods embodied these truths in narratives that could be understood by illiterate farmers and pondered by sophisticated theologians. The worship of these gods involved all the senses. Incense made from frankincense and myrrh, imported from Arabia, filled the temples with smoke that was believed to carry prayers to heaven. Sacred meals were shared between worshippers and deities. The meat of sacrificed animals cooked and consumed in communal feasts that reinforced social bonds while honoring divine ones. Music played on lyres and drums, cymbals and flutes, created soundscapes that transported worshippers from mundane to sacred time. And in the sacred gardens, the high places that the later biblical texts would condemn so fiercely, something else happened. These weren't just sites of nature worship, but places where the boundary between human and divine became permeable. Under the trees sacred to Asherah, in the groves where her wooden poles stood, women could speak prophecies, men could receive visions, and for brief moments, the gods walked again in gardens, as they had at the beginning of time. The Canaanite religious system would profoundly influence the development of Judaism, though the biblical texts work hard to deny this connection. The Hebrew word for God, El, is the same as the Canaanite high god. The imagery of God fighting the sea monster, Leviathan echoes Baal's battle with Yam. The Psalms contain passages that could have come straight from Ugaritic texts, the same parallel structures, the same poetic devices, the same cosmic imagery of gods gathering in divine council. Baal's thunder, Yam's rage. The scribes of Ugarit who recorded the Baal cycle weren't merely preserving folklore, they were encoding the deepest anxieties and highest aspirations of Canaanite civilization. In tablet after tablet, pressed into clay with careful cuneiform wedges, they captured a mythology that explained not just how the world worked, but why it so often seemed to work against human happiness. The battle between Baal and Yam wasn't simply a conflict between storm and sea. Yam represented everything that threatened Canaanite existence, the chaotic waters that could destroy merchant ships, the foreign powers that came from across the sea, the fundamental disorder that lurked at the edges of their carefully constructed world. When Baal faces Yam in the divine assembly, he faces him not with superior strength, but with superior technology. Those two clubs crafted by Kothawa Kassis, the divine craftsman whose forge was said to be in Memphis and whose workshop was in Crete. Even in their mythology, the Canaanites acknowledged that survival required not just courage but innovation, not just divine favor but practical skill. The poetry itself demonstrates sophisticated literary techniques that would influence religious literature for millennia. Consider this passage, translated from the Ugaritic. When Baal saw his daughters, he fixed his eye on them and laughed. He raised his voice and declared, "I shall place them in the recesses of the divine mountain, in the hollows of the mountain of victory." The parallel structure, recesses of the divine mountain, matched with hollows of their mountain of victory, creates a rhythmic incantation that would have been chanted in temples, the repetition drilling the narrative into memory while creating an almost hypnotic effect. But the Baal cycle reveals something else about Canaanite theology that sets it apart from both Egyptian and Mesopotamian religious thought. Their gods could die. Baal's death at the hands of Mot wasn't symbolic or temporary in the way modern readers might assume. When the text says, "Baal has fallen to the earth, dead," it means exactly that. The god of fertility, the bringer of rain, the sustainer of life, was genuinely dead, and with him died hope itself. The mourning rituals that followed Baal's death were enacted annually in Canaanite cities, a collective grief that bound communities together. Women would tear their clothes and pour ashes on their heads. Men would cut themselves with bronze blades, letting their blood water the dry earth in sympathetic magic. The king himself would descend from his throne and sit in the dust, acknowledging that without the rains Baal brought, his power meant nothing. Yet the cycle also contains moments of surprising tenderness. When Baal returns from death, his first thought is for his daughters, the goddesses of dew and rain. He embraces them with a father's joy, and their own happiness is described in terms that any parent would recognize. They laugh, they dance, they sing songs of welcome. The cosmic drama suddenly becomes intimately human, reminding worshippers that the gods, for all their power, understood family, understood love, understood the simple joy of reunion. The theological implications were profound. If gods could die, then nothing was permanent, nothing was absolutely secure. This wasn't the eternal order of Egypt, where pharaohs became gods and gods never changed. This wasn't the inexorable fate of Mesopotamia, where human destiny was written in the stars. This was a theology of cycles, of death and rebirth, of battles that had to be fought again and again. It was a theology perfectly suited to a people who couldn't rely on the regular floods of great rivers, who had to read the signs each year and hope the rains would come. Modern readers often miss the environmental message embedded in these myths. When Baal builds his palace, he insists on windows, apertures, through which rain can fall to earth. When he opens them, the rains come. When he closes them in fear of his enemy, drought follows. The message was clear. The divine realm and the natural world were connected through specific mechanisms that could be influenced by proper ritual, proper behavior, proper respect for the cosmic order. The influence of this mythological system extended far beyond Canaan itself. The Greeks would adopt many of these stories, transforming Baal into Zeus, another thunder god who fought titans and monsters. The biblical tradition would appropriate the imagery while condemning the theology. Decius, Yahweh would split the sea like Baal, would fight Leviathan like Baal fought Lotan, would bring rain to the faithful and drought to the wicked. Even today, when we speak of conquering death, of the eternal cycle of seasons, of gods who die and rise again, we're using conceptual frameworks first articulated in Canaanite mythology. The discovery and translation of the Baal cycle in the 20th century sent shockwaves through biblical studies. Here was proof that the unique monotheism of ancient Israel emerged not in isolation, but in dialogue with the Asar, and often in reaction against a sophisticated, polytheistic system. The prophets who railed against Baal worship weren't condemning primitive superstition, but competing with a fully developed theology that had satisfied human spiritual needs for millennia. The scribe of Ugarit. You sit in the scriptorium of the royal palace at Ugarit, the afternoon light filtering through narrow windows, designed to provide illumination without letting in too much heat. Your fingers are stained with clay, your back aches from hunching over your work table, but your mind is fully engaged in the delicate task before you. You're not copying some mundane inventory or routine contract. You're transcribing the words of the gods themselves, the sacred stories that explain why the world is the way it is. The tablet before you is small, fitting easily in your palm, but it will contain hundreds of lines of text, each character no bigger than a grain of barley. Your stylus, a carved reed with a triangular tip, feels like an extension of your hand after all these years. You've been training for this since you were 7 years old, when your uncle, himself a scribe, noticed your quick mind and steady hand and recommended you for the palace school. The clay must be exactly the right consistency, the too wet, and the characters blur, too dry, and the stylus won't make clean impressions. You prepared this batch yourself this morning, mixing the fine river clay with just enough water, kneading it like bread dough until it reached the perfect plasticity. Now you work quickly but carefully, pressing the stylus at precise angles to create the wedge-shaped marks that represent sounds, building words, building sentences, building worlds. Around you, other scribes work at their own tasks. The elderly master in the corner is composing a letter to the king of Egypt, each word chosen for its diplomatic weight. The young apprentice near the door is practicing his alphabet, the same 30 letters over and over, his tongue poking out in concentration. The middle-aged woman across from you, one of only 3 female scribes in the palace, is working on a legal contract, her brow furrowed as she ensures every clause is airtight. The story you're copying is ancient, passed down through generations of oral poets before someone first committed it to clay. But you're not just copying, you're also interpreting, making choices about spelling, about line breaks, about which variant of a repeated passage to use. You're a link in a chain that stretches back to the beginning of memory and forward to futures you can't imagine. Sometimes, when you press your stylus into the clay, you feel the weight of that responsibility. These tablets you're creating will outlast the palace walls, outlast the city itself. Long after Ugarit has fallen, and in your darker moments, you sense that fall, approaching like a storm on the horizon. These stories will endure. Fire cannot destroy them. It only bakes them harder. Water cannot erase them. The clay has already been dried. Only deliberate destruction can eliminate them. And even then, fragments survive. You pause to flex your cramping fingers and notice the light has shifted, grown more golden. Soon it will be time for the evening meal, for conversations with other scribes about the day's work, for the small pleasures of wine and companionship that make the long hours bearable. But for now, you return to your tablet, to the story of how Baal defeated death, how Anat rescued her beloved, how the rains returned to a parched land. Your stylus presses into clay, and the words of gods take physical form through your very human hands. Cedar ships and purple sails. The shipyards of Tyre never slept. Even in the darkest hours before dawn, you could hear the sound of bronze saws biting through cedar logs, the rhythm of hammers driving wooden pegs into carefully drilled holes, the creak of ropes as massive timbers were maneuvered into position. By 1500 BC, Phoenician shipbuilding had evolved into something approaching an industrial process. Though each vessel remained a unique creation, shaped by the master shipwright's eye and the particular qualities of the wood at hand. The cedar of Lebanon was the foundation of Phoenician naval supremacy. This wasn't just any wood, it was timber that resisted rot in salt water, that remained flexible enough to withstand the stress of waves without splitting, that contained natural oils that repelled the shipworms that could destroy an oak vessel in a single season. The trees grew slowly in the mountains, their wood becoming denser and stronger with each passing decade. A single ship might require cedars that had been growing since before the pyramids were built. The design of Phoenician vessels represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. The hulls were deep and broad, capable of carrying enormous cargo loads while remaining stable in rough seas. The proportion of length to width, roughly 4:1, had been arrived at through trial and error. Countless ships lost to storms, teaching harsh lessons about balance and buoyancy. The bow rose high and curved backward, often carved into the shape of a horse's head, both for religious protection and to help the vessel ride over waves rather than plough through them. But the true innovation was below the waterline. Phoenician shipwrights had discovered that a ship with a keel, a solid timber running the entire length of the bottom, could sail closer to the wind, could maintain a straighter course, could carry more sail without capsizing. This single architectural element transformed sailing from a matter of going where the wind pushed you to being able to choose your direction, to tack against the wind, to treat the Mediterranean not as a series of seasonal routes, but as an open field of possibilities. The sails themselves were works of art. The purple sails of Tyrian merchants weren't just displays of wealth, though they certainly were that, but practical tools of identification. In an age before flags or standardized markers, a purple sail could be recognized from miles away, telling pirates that this ship was under the protection of Tyre, telling harbour masters that these merchants could pay their fees, telling other traders that competition had arrived. The process of preparing a ship for a major voyage was a ritual in itself. The hull would be sealed with bitumen imported from the Dead Sea, painted in thick black layers that would keep the wood watertight for months. The rigging, made from papyrus twisted into rope in Egyptian workshops, had to be checked and rechecked, each knot tested, each connection point reinforced. The ship's eyes, painted or inlaid on either side of the bow, had to be renewed so the vessel could see its way through dangerous waters. Navigation was an art that fathers passed to sons, uncles to nephews, masters to apprentices. The Phoenicians had no compass, no sextant, no charts in the modern sense. Instead, they had knowledge, the kind that comes from generations of observation. They knew that certain birds meant land was near, that the color of water indicated depth, that clouds formed differently over islands than over open sea. They navigated by the stars, particularly the constellation they called the Bear, but which Greeks would later call the Phoenician constellation in their honor. The routes they established would be used for millennia. From Tyre to Cyprus, for copper, a journey of a day and a night if the winds were favorable. From Cyprus to the southern coast of Anatolia, following the current that swept eastward along the shore. Then the crucial decision: have AC to continue east toward the wealthy but dangerous ports of Syria, or to turn west toward the Aegean, where Greek cities hungered for eastern luxuries. Some ships went much farther. Phoenician vessels reached the Atlantic coast of Morocco, established Cadiz beyond the Pillars of Hercules, possibly even reached Britain for tin and Ireland for gold. These weren't journeys of exploration in the modern sense. They were commercial ventures, each stop calculated for profit, each risk weighed against potential reward. A single successful voyage to the tin mines of Cornwall could make a merchant wealthy for life. A single storm in the Bay of Biscay could destroy everything. The crews were as international as the routes. A typical Phoenician merchant vessel might have a Tyrian captain, an Egyptian navigator who knew the currents of the Nile Delta, Greek sailors who understood the treacherous winds of the Aegean, Cypriot metalworkers who could repair bronze fittings, Nubian soldiers for protection, and slaves from a dozen nations pulling the oars when the wind failed. The ship itself became a floating piece of the cosmopolitan world the Phoenicians were creating, where race and nationality mattered less than skill and reliability. Twilight offerings. The sun descends toward the western sea, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seem to bleed into the water itself. At the high place outside Sidon, the evening sacrifice begins, as it has begun every evening for 1,000 years, as it will begin for 1,000 more, if the gods permit. The altar is ancient carved limestone, its top blackened by countless fires, its sides stained dark with blood and wine and oil. The priest moves slowly, his aged joints protesting each step, but his movements retain the precision of decades of practice. In his hands, he carries a pottery bowl filled with grain mixed with frankincense, the smoke of which will carry prayers to the gods dwelling on their sacred mountain. The congregation is small tonight, a handful of merchants seeking divine favor for upcoming voyages, a young couple hoping for a child, an old woman whose whispered prayers have the urgency of approaching death. They stand in a semicircle, close enough to feel the heat when the offering fire is lit, far enough to show proper respect for the sacred space. As twilight deepens, the priest begins the ancient chant, his voice rising and falling in cadences older than any living memory. The words are archaic, some of their meanings lost even to scholars, but their sound carries power, the rolling rhythms of primordial language, the first attempts of humans to speak to the divine. The frankincense catches fire, and sweet smoke rises straight up in the still evening air, a pillar connecting earth to heaven. Somewhere in the city below, drums begin to beat, a slow rhythm that matches a resting heartbeat. Other instruments join, the breathy sound of reed flutes, the shimmer of bronze cymbals, the deep throb of a horn made from a ram's horn. The music doesn't overwhelm the ceremony, but underlies it, gives it a pulse, makes it live in ways that words alone cannot achieve. The Amarna correspondence. In the 14th century BC, as Egypt's new kingdom reached its zenith under pharaohs like Amenhotep III and the revolutionary Akhenaten, a remarkable collection of diplomatic correspondence was accumulating in the royal archives at el-Amarna. These weren't the boastful inscriptions of victory that decorated temple walls, nor the formulaic hymns to divine pharaohs. These were real letters, written by real kings and governors, filled with real desperation, real ambition, real fear. The Canaanite rulers who wrote these letters occupied an impossible position, nominally vassals of Egypt. They were expected to provide tribute, maintain order, and support Egyptian interests. But Egypt was far away, its armies often occupied elsewhere, its attention frequently distracted by internal politics or campaigns in Nubia. Meanwhile, the Hittite Empire pressed from the north, offering alternative alliances, alternative protection, alternative masters, and all around them, other Canaanite rulers played their own games, seeking to expand their territories at their neighbours' expense. Rib-Hadda of Byblos wrote more than 60 letters to the Egyptian court, each more desperate than the last. "I am like a bird in a cage," he wrote, using imagery that would resonate through centuries of literature. His city was under siege by Abdi-Ashirta of Amurru, a warlord who claimed to serve Egypt while systematically conquering Egyptian vassals. Rib-Hadda's letters trace a tragic arc, from confidence to concern to outright panic. "Why does my lord abandon his servant? If the king cannot send troops, send ships to evacuate me and my family, lest we die." The language of these letters reveals the complex cultural dynamics of the Late Bronze Age. They were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the era, but filled with Canaanite words and phrases when Akkadian lacked the necessary vocabulary. Egyptian terms appear when discussing administrative matters. Hurrian names indicate the presence of northern peoples moving into Canaanite territories. It's a linguistic mixing bowl that reflects the cosmopolitan nature of these city-states. Abdi-Haber of Jerusalem, CZ, then a minor hill town called Urushalim, Amasi, wrote letters that combine obsequiousness with barely concealed threat. "The king has placed his name in Jerusalem forever," he declares, reminding the pharaoh of his obligations. But then he adds, "The Habaru are plundering all the king's lands. If there are no archers this year, the king will have no lands or governors." The identity of these Habaru remains debated. Were they the Hebrews of biblical tradition, or simply a social class of displaced persons who threatened established order? The letters don't tell us, but they document a period of upheaval that would reshape the entire region. The most successful players in this diplomatic game were those who understood that loyalty was a commodity to be traded rather than a principle to be maintained. The king of Tyre wrote letters of perfect propriety, assuring the pharaoh of his eternal devotion while simultaneously maintaining cordial relations with Egypt's enemies. The ruler of Ashkelon sent tribute to Egypt while accepting gifts from Hittite ambassadors. These weren't acts of treachery so much as survival strategies in a world where the difference between ally and enemy could change with a single diplomatic marriage or military campaign. What makes the Amarna letters so valuable is their revelation of the human reality behind great power politics. These weren't abstract entities called Egypt and Canaan, interacting according to inevitable historical forces. These were individuals, anxious, ambitious, clever, desperate individuals, trying to navigate circumstances they only partially understood with incomplete information and limited resources. Rib-Hadda didn't know that the Egyptian empire was beginning its slow decline. Abdi-Haber couldn't foresee that his small mountain town would one day become one of history's most contested cities. The letters also reveal the sophisticated intelligence networks these rulers maintained. They knew about troop movements hundreds of miles away, about secret negotiations between their rivals, about changes in Egyptian court politics that might affect their standing. Information was traded as readily as copper or cedar, and a well-placed informant was worth more than a company of soldiers. The ultimate fate of many of these correspondents remains unknown. Rib-Hadda's letters simply stop, suggesting his worst fears were realized. Some cities mentioned in the letters would vanish so completely that archaeologists still debate their locations. Others, like Tyre and Sidon, would survive the coming collapse and emerge as the great Phoenician powers of the Iron Age. The letters themselves, baked hard when Amarna was abandoned and buried in sand for 3,000 years, survived to give us this intimate glimpse into an age of anxiety that preceded one of history's great catastrophes. Dancing with empires. The art of surviving between empires required skills that no military academy could teach. It demanded an intuitive understanding of when to bend and when to stand firm, when to pay tribute and when to claim poverty, when to invoke ancient treaties and when to conveniently forget them. The Canaanite rulers, who mastered this dance, could maintain their independence for generations. Those who stumbled found their cities burned, their populations enslaved, their names erased from history. Consider the strategy of Nickmadu II of Ugarit in the 13th century BC. His city sat at the intersection of every major trade route and imperial ambition in the eastern Mediterranean. To the south, Egypt claimed him as a vassal. To the north, the Hittite Empire demanded his allegiance. To the east, Assyria was beginning to stir, its armies probing westward. To the west, Mycenaean Greeks and Cypriots competed for commercial dominance. Nickmadu's solution was brilliantly pragmatic. He signed a treaty with the Hittites that recognized their suzerainty, but carefully negotiated exemptions that left him functionally independent. He agreed to provide military support, but only for defensive wars, not offensive campaigns. He would pay tribute, but in goods rather than silver, allowing him to send surplus production rather than draining his treasury. Most cleverly, he negotiated the right to maintain direct diplomatic relations with Egypt, claiming this was necessary for trade purposes, but actually creating a balance between the two powers. The economic clauses of his treaties were masterpieces of calculated ambiguity. Ugarit would have most favored nation status with the Hittites, but the definition of what this meant was left vague enough that Nickmadu could interpret it as circumstances required. Hittite merchants could trade in Ugarit, but they had to pay the same taxes as locals, effectively limiting their competitive advantage. Ugaritic merchants could travel throughout the Hittite Empire, but they retained the right to their own legal system, meaning commercial disputes would be settled by Ugaritic law, even in Hittite territory. This diplomatic sophistication extended to marriage politics. The royal families of Canaan wove a web of marriages that created overlapping loyalties and obligations. A princess from Tyre, married to a prince of Sidon, created an alliance. Their daughter married to a noble of Byblos extended that alliance. Their son married to an Egyptian official's daughter brought Egypt into the network. Within 3 generations, every major player was related to every other, making warfare not impossible but certainly more complicated. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity. When a Canaanite king accepted Hittite suzerainty, did that mean accepting Hittite gods? When paying tribute to Egypt, should offerings to Egyptian deities be included? The Canaanites solved this through theological flexibility that would have horrified later monotheists. Gods were translated across cultures. Baal became Seth in Egypt, Teshub among the Hittites, Zeus among the Greeks. This wasn't seen as betrayal, but as recognition that divine power manifested differently in different places. Intelligence gathering was crucial to this diplomatic dance. Canaanite rulers maintained networks of informants throughout the region. Merchants doubled as spies, reporting on troop movements and political changes. Priests at international sanctuaries gathered gossip from pilgrims. Even entertainers, musicians, dancers, acrobats could serve as sources of information, their mobility and perceived harmlessness, giving them access to places official ambassadors could never reach. The key to successful diplomacy was maintaining multiple options. When the Hittite king demanded increased tribute, the ruler of Ugarit could hint at Egyptian offers of protection. When Egypt pressed for military support, Hittite treaty obligations could be invoked. When both empires made simultaneous demands, sudden pirates' raids or natural disasters could make compliance temporarily impossible. The archives of Ugarit contain letters of elaborate excuse-making that would be comic if the stakes hadn't been so deadly serious. The metalworker's secret. His name was Yakindagan, and he knew something that could destroy kingdoms or build them, depending on who possessed the knowledge. In his workshop in the lower city of Ugarit, surrounded by the constant clamour of hammers on anvils and the acrid smell of heated metal, he practiced an art that was part chemistry, part magic, part closely guarded trade secret. Bronze itself was no mystery. The alloy of copper and tin had been known for over 1,000 years, but Yakindagan knew the precise ratios that would produce bronze hard enough for weapons, but flexible enough not to shatter on impact. He knew which trace elements, added in amounts so small they could barely be measured, would change the colour from common brown to a golden shade that marked premium products. He knew how to read the colour of heated metal to determine the exact moment for quenching, how the speed of cooling affected crystalline structure, how working the metal when cold could increase its strength. This knowledge hadn't come easily. His grandfather had paid a fortune to apprentice him to a master from Cyprus, where the finest metalworkers in the eastern Mediterranean practiced their craft. For 7 years, he had done nothing but tend fires and carry water, watching everything, remembering everything, saying nothing. Only in his 8th year was he allowed to hold a hammer. Only in his 10th was he permitted to mix alloys. By his 15th year, he knew secrets that kings would kill to possess. The real secret, though, wasn't bronze, but what was coming next. In his private workshop, behind a door even his apprentices weren't allowed to pass, Yakindagan worked with a new metal, one that came from the north, from the lands of the Hittites who guarded its production as jealously as the Egyptians guarded the locations of their gold mines. Iron. Not the brittle cast iron that sometimes fell from the sky in meteorites, but worked iron, carburized iron, iron that could hold an edge sharper than the finest bronze. He had only small amounts, traded for at enormous cost, each ingot worth its weight in silver, but he had learned to work it, learned the much higher temperatures it required, learned the repeated heating and hammering that turned raw bloom into usable metal. He had made 3 daggers so far, each one better than the last, each one a step toward mastery of this new technology that would, he sensed, change everything. Asherah's sacred groves. In the grove sacred to Asherah, 3 miles inland from Tyre, the afternoon light filters green through cedar branches that have never known the bite of bronze. This is sacred space, marked not by walls but by absence, the absence of human construction, of male voices, of the endless negotiations and calculations that define city life. The trees here are ancient, their trunks so vast that 6 women holding hands cannot encircle them. Their roots run deep, deeper than memory, touching something primordial that existed before gods had names, before humans learned to shape words into prayers. The priestesses say Asherah herself planted these trees at the beginning of time, watering them with the tears she shed for her children who would die, nurturing them with the blood she would shed in childbirth. Women come here for reasons they don't always articulate, even to themselves. A mother whose milk has dried up, desperate to feed her infant. A wife whose husband's seed refuses to take root in her womb. A daughter watching her mother fade from some illness the city physicians cannot name. They bring offerings, bread they've baked themselves, oil pressed from their own olives, sometimes just wildflowers gathered on the walk from the city. The rituals here are older than the formal temple ceremonies, older perhaps than the gods themselves. A pregnant woman walks slowly around a particular tree, her hand never leaving its bark, whispering her fears to the wood that has heard such fears for generations uncounted. A group of girls, on the edge of womanhood, dance in a clearing, their movements unconsciously mimicking the swaying of branches in wind, their voices raised in songs their grandmothers taught them. There is power here, though it's not the kind of power that builds cities or conquers enemies. It's the power of continuity, of cycles, of the knowledge that long after the current crisis has passed, these trees will still stand, still shade the ground, still offer sanctuary to those who need it. The language that conquered time. By 1300 BC, the Phoenician alphabet had evolved from its experimental origins into something approaching its final form, 22 letters, that would become the ancestors of almost every alphabetic script on Earth. But this wasn't just an evolution of writing. It was a revolution in human consciousness, a democratization of knowledge that would have consequences no one could have foreseen. In the scribal schools of Byblos and Tyre, children as young as 6 were learning to write. Not the children of nobility only, though they were certainly represented, but the children of merchants, skilled craftsmen, even successful farmers. The alphabet was simple enough that a bright child could master the basics in a matter of months, not the years required for cuneiform or hieroglyphics. The implications rippled outward like waves. Contracts could be written and understood by both parties, not just by professional scribes who might have their own agendas. Love letters could be exchanged, private thoughts recorded, family histories preserved. The human memory, previously the only repository of most knowledge, could be supplemented, corrected, expanded. But it was in commerce that the alphabet showed its most immediate practical value. A merchant could keep his own records, encode his own trade secrets, correspond directly with partners in distant cities. The standardization of the alphabet across the Phoenician world meant that a letter written in Tyre could be read in Carthage, in Cadiz, in Cyprus, anywhere purple sails found harbour. The Greeks would later claim they invented the alphabet, adding vowels to the Phoenician consonantal system, but they preserved the evidence of their borrowing in the very names of their letters: alpha from aleph, beta from bet, gamma from gimel. When a Greek child learned the alphabet, they were unconsciously reciting Phoenician words: ox, house, camel, the mnemonic devices of another culture embedded forever in their own. The spread wasn't always smooth or immediate. Conservative scribal traditions resisted, especially in Egypt and Mesopotamia, where entire social classes depended on the complexity of older writing systems for their status and livelihood. But the advantage of the alphabet was too great to resist. By the time of the Bronze Age collapse, it had spread throughout the Levant into Anatolia, across to Cyprus and Crete. Each culture that adopted it made modifications. The Arameans would streamline it further, creating the script that would become the administrative language of the Persian Empire. The Hebrews would adapt it for their sacred texts, adding pointing systems to indicate vowels without changing the consonantal structure. The Arabs would transform it into a flowing cursive that could capture the rhythms of poetry and the precision of mathematics. The Romans, receiving the alphabet through Etruscan intermediaries who had gotten it from the Greeks, who had gotten it from the Phoenicians, would add their own genius for standardization and spread it throughout their empire. The Latin alphabet would evolve into the scripts of all Western European languages, would travel to the Americas with conquistadors and colonists, would become the default script of international commerce and science. But perhaps the most profound impact was philosophical. The alphabet made possible the idea that knowledge could be universal rather than elite, that literacy could be widespread rather than restricted, that human thoughts could transcend time and space. Every democratic ideal, every scientific revolution, every religious reformation that depended on widespread literacy owes a debt to those unknown Canaanites who first thought to represent sounds with simple signs. Walking through Hazor, you enter Hazor through the massive eastern gate, its basalt foundations so perfectly fitted that a knife blade cannot slip between the stones. This is the largest city in Canaan, home to perhaps 20,000 souls, its upper tell rising like an artificial mountain above the lower city that sprawls across 200 acres of fertile plain. The gate passage is cool and dark, a tunnel through walls 30 feet thick, designed to channel attackers into killing fields, where defenders can rain arrows and stones from above. But today, the gates stand open, have stood open for so long that merchants have set up semi-permanent stalls in the very passage meant for war. You smell cinnamon from the far south, cedar resin from the northern mountains, the distinctive tang of garum, that fermented fish sauce the Mycenaeans inexplicably crave. Emerging into sunlight, you're immediately overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the place. The main street is wide enough for 2 ox carts to pass without touching, paved with crushed limestone that gleams white in the morning sunday. Multi-story buildings rise on either side, their ground floors devoted to commerce, their upper stories to residence. You can tell the wealth of the inhabitants by their windows. The poor have none. The middle class have small openings covered with wooden lattices. The wealthy have actual glass, imported at enormous expense from Egypt or Syria. The noise is overwhelming. Merchants cry their wares in a dozen languages. Hammers ring on anvils from the metalworkers' quarter. Sheep bleat from temporary pens, where country folk have brought them for sale. Children shriek in play, dodging between the legs of adults who curse them in various tongues. A procession of priests moves through the crowd, their chanted prayers creating a pocket of relative silence that moves with them like a bubble through chaos. You follow the main street toward the palace complex on the upper tell, climbing stone steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. Halfway up, you pause to look back over the lower city, and the organization that wasn't apparent from street level becomes clear. The city is divided into quarters, metal workers here, potters there, weavers in another section, each craft clustering together for mutual advantage and protection. The temple complexes are easily identified by their open courtyards and the smoke rising from sacrificial altars. The palace district is a different world. Here the streets are narrower but cleaner, the buildings faced with cut stone rather than mud brick, the air scented with cultivated gardens rather than urban refuse. Guards in bronze-scale armor stand at regular intervals, their spears marking the boundary between public and restricted space. This is where the great decisions are made, where ambassadors are received, where the fate of cities is determined by men who may never have walked the streets you just climbed. You're permitted into the outer courtyard, where official business is conducted. The walls are decorated with carved reliefs, showing the king's victories, his piety, his wealth. But you notice the carving style changes partway along one wall, a different king claiming credit for the same victories, history being rewritten in stone. The original inscriptions are still partially visible, ghostly letters beneath the new text, a palimpsest of power that tells its own story about the impermanence of earthly glory. The ivory palaces, the ivory workshops of 13th century Canaan produced objects of such exquisite beauty that they would be treasured for millennia, passed down through generations, buried with kings, offered to gods. The craft required not just artistic skill but international connections, since elephant ivory had to be imported from Africa, either through Egypt or via the incense routes of Arabia. In the workshop of master carver Shipti Baal in Megiddo, apprentices learned that ivory was not simply white stone that could be carved. It was organic, still alive in some sense, with a grain like wood that had to be respected. Cut across the grain, and the piece would splinter. Work it when too dry, and it would crack. But treat it properly, keep it at the right humidity, oil it regularly, with specific mixtures of plant oils and beeswax, and it would last forever, actually growing more beautiful with age, as it developed a patina like honey-coloured moonlight. The designs carved into these small plaques told stories within stories. A common motif was the woman at the window, possibly representing the goddess Astarte looking out at the world. Possibly a sacred prostitute advertising her availability, possibly both, possibly neither. The ambiguity was intentional, allowing the viewer to see what they wanted to see, what their own cultural context prepared them to see. The technical skill required was extraordinary, using tools not much different from those a dentist might employ: tiny chisels, miniature saws, abrasives made from crushed pumice. The carvers could create scenes of incredible complexity on surfaces no larger than a playing card. A piece might show a garden party with dozens of individual figures, each with distinct clothing and jewelry, each face unique, the whole composition balanced perfectly, despite its microscopic scale. These ivories weren't simply decorative, they were functional components of palace furniture. They were inlaid into wooden thrones, creating surfaces that were cool to the touch in the Mediterranean heat. They formed the headboards of beds, where kings slept and conceived dynasties. They decorated boxes that held cosmetics, jewelry, the apparatus of beauty and power. They were symbols of international connection, of wealth sufficient to import materials from the ends of the earth, of craftsmen skilled enough to transform those materials into objects worthy of gods. The influence of Canaanite ivory carving spread throughout the Mediterranean world. When archaeologists excavate palaces from Assyria to Egypt to Greece, they find these distinctive ivories, sometimes clearly Phoenician imports, sometimes local imitations, that never quite capture the fluidity and grace of the originals. The style became so influential that Phoenician ivory became a category unto itself, studied in art history courses, displayed in museums, still capable of taking breath away with its beauty 3,000 years after creation. When the Sea Peoples came, the catastrophe began with rumours carried by traders whose routes were disrupted, whose regular ports had gone silent. Something was happening in the west, in the lands beyond Cyprus. Cities were burning, populations were moving. The ordered world that had existed for centuries was coming apart like a tapestry with its edges set aflame. The year was approximately 1200 BC, though precision is impossible when dealing with civilizational collapse. What we know comes from fragments, a burned layer in the archaeological record here, a desperate letter there, Egyptian temple inscriptions that record victories that sound suspiciously like barely survived disasters. The people who appeared off the Canaanite coast weren't a unified force but a confederation of the desperate, the displaced, the dispossessed. The Egyptians, who fought them and sometimes hired them as mercenaries, gave them names: Peleset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, names that might correspond to known peoples or might be Egyptian attempts to categorize chaos. We call them the Sea Peoples, and in that vague designation lies our continued inability to fully understand what happened. They came in ships unlike anything the Canaanites had seen before, powered by sails but also by disciplined rowing, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than cargo capacity. Their warriors wore distinctive, feathered headdresses that made them look taller, more intimidating. They fought with long swords rather than the shorter weapons favoured by Canaanite and Egyptian forces, giving them reach advantage in close combat. But their most devastating weapon was desperation. They weren't raiding for profit, but migrating for survival, bringing their families, their possessions, their entire cultures with them. Ugarit saw them coming. The last archives of the city contain increasingly frantic correspondence. A letter from the king of el-Amarna, Cyprus, warns, "Enemy ships have appeared in the sea. They have burned my cities and done evil things in my land. All my forces are in the land of Hatti. All my ships are in Lycia. The country is abandoned to itself." The king of Ugarit replies that he has sent his fleet north to assist allies, leaving his own city defenseless. It was the last letter he would ever send. The destruction of Ugarit was total. The palace was burned so thoroughly that the stone stairs cracked from heat. The archive rooms, where the great literary and commercial tablets were stored, became inadvertent kilns, firing the clay so hard that the tablets survived to our day, but the scribes who created them vanished without trace. The port that had welcomed ships from across the known world filled with silt. Within a generation, people had forgotten where the great city had stood. Other Canaanite cities suffered similar fates. Hazor, that mighty citadel, was put to the torch. The ivory palaces of Megiddo collapsed into ash. Even cities that survived, like Byblos and Sidon, were transformed, reduced, their international connections severed, their confidence shattered. The Bronze Age civilization that had flourished for over a millennium ended not with conquest by a greater power, but with dissolution, like a pearl necklace whose string has been cut, scattering precious beads across the floor. The last king of Ugarit. Amurapi was 32 years old when he became the last king of one of history's great cities, though of course he didn't know he would be the last. He had been educated for rule since childhood, trained in diplomacy, warfare, religious ritual, and most importantly, in the delicate art of keeping a small, wealthy city independent in a world of predatory empires. His father had died suddenly, possibly poisoned, though such things were never investigated too closely in royal circles. Amurapi's first crisis came within days of his coronation, when 7 ships appeared on the horizon. Not the familiar profiles of merchant vessels, but something new, something wrong. They made no attempt to signal their intentions, sent no embassy to negotiate harbour fees. They simply came on, inexorable as a tide. He had perhaps 2,000 soldiers at his disposal, but most were dispersed, guarding trade routes, manning border fortresses, serving as marines on merchant vessels. The city's walls were strong, but they faced landward, designed to repel armies marching down from Anatolia or up from Egypt. The sea had always been Ugarit's friend, its highway, its source of wealth. No one had seriously contemplated an attack from that direction. Amurapi sent urgent messages to his overlord, the Hittite emperor, reminding him of treaty obligations, begging for military support. The response, when it finally came, was itself desperate. The enemy advances against us. Send whatever troops you have, send them immediately. The great Hittite Empire, master of Anatolia for centuries, was itself collapsing. There would be no help from that quarter. He tried negotiation, sending ambassadors with offers of tribute, of alliance, of whatever the strangers wanted. Some never returned. Others came back with reports that made no sense. The attackers didn't seem interested in gold or treaties. They wanted the city itself, its buildings, its infrastructure, its geographical position. They were not conquerors but replacers, intending not to rule the Canaanites but to become them. In his last days, as smoke from burning suburbs drifted across the palace, Amurapi did something remarkable. He ordered the royal archives sealed, the most important tablets buried in underground vaults. Perhaps he hoped the crisis would pass, that the city would be rebuilt, that future generations would need these records. Or perhaps he simply wanted something of Ugarit to survive, some evidence that his people had existed, had created, had mattered. The final assault came at dawn, the attackers using the rising sun behind them to blind the defenders. We don't know how Amurapi died, whether he fell defending the palace gates, whether he was captured and executed, whether he escaped to die in exile. His name appears in no subsequent records. The throne room, where he had received ambassadors, became a charnel house. The treasury he had carefully maintained was looted and scattered. The city that had stood for 2,000 years died in a single day. Smoke over the harbours. The smoke rises in columns that lean eastward with the prevailing wind, carrying the smell of burning cedar, melting bronze, charred grain, and something else, the distinctive odour of civilization itself burning, of libraries becoming ash, of accumulated centuries of human effort returning to their constituent elements. From the hills above the coastal plain, refugees watch their world end. The harbours that once welcomed ships from every corner of the known world now shelter only burning wrecks. Their purple sails turn to black carbon that floats on the wind like morning snow. The warehouses that stored the treasures of international trade collapse inward, their mud brick walls baking into shapeless masses that will puzzle archaeologists 3,000 years hence. The silence is perhaps the most disturbing element. Cities that had hummed with commerce, rung with the sound of hammers on anvils, echoed with the calls of merchants and the songs of workers, now produce only the sporadic crack of heated stone splitting, the crash of another roof beam giving way, the soft susurrus of flame consuming everything combustible. Some refugees carry what they could save: a clay tablet with important contracts, a small ivory carving that was a family heirloom, a handful of silver coins that might buy food in whatever stable land they can reach. But most carry only trauma, only memory, only the knowledge of skills that may or may not be valuable in whatever new world emerges from this catastrophe. Phoenix from the ashes, the metaphor was perhaps inevitable. The phoenix, that mythical bird that burns to ash, only to rise again, became associated with the Phoenicians, not through any ancient tradition, but through the happy accident of similar-sounding Greek words. Yet no symbol could better capture what happened to the coastal Canaanites after the Bronze Age collapse. Their great cities burned, their international trade networks shattered, their political structures dissolved, and from those ashes arose something new, something that would prove more influential than what had come before. The transformation didn't happen immediately. For perhaps a century after 1200 BC, the Levantine coast was a wasteland of abandoned cities and disrupted trade routes. The survivors clustered in the few settlements that had weathered the storm. Byblos, diminished but intact. Sidon, protected by its position. Tyre, built on an island that had proved impossible for the sea peoples to assault. These cities became arcs, preserving not just population, but knowledge. How to navigate by stars, how to produce purple dye, how to write with alphabetic symbols. The recovery began with small ventures, tentative explorations, to see what remained of the old world. A ship from Tyre sailing to Cyprus, finding the copper mines still producing, the harbours still functional though under new management. A vessel from Sidon reaching Egypt, discovering that the pharaohs, weakened though they were, still desired cedar for their temples, purple cloth for their regalia. Step by step, voyage by voyage, the Phoenicians began rebuilding their networks, though the world they built would be fundamentally different from what had come before. The new reality required adaptation. Without the protective framework of the great Bronze Age empires, the Phoenician cities had to develop new strategies for survival. They became more explicitly commercial, less concerned with territorial control than with maintaining trading posts and safe harbours. They developed a form of colonization unlike anything practiced by the land-based empires. Small communities established at strategic points, connected by sea routes, each maintaining cultural ties to the mother city while adapting to local conditions. The Phoenicians also became more technologically innovative. They developed new ship designs with deeper drafts and multiple banks of oars, vessels that could sail farther from shore, carry more cargo, survive rougher seas. They improved their navigation techniques, learning to sail at night using the constellation they called the Bear, which Greeks would later name the Phoenician constellation in their honor. They standardized their weights and measures across their trading network, creating one of the world's first international commercial standards. Most importantly, they became cultural transmitters on an unprecedented scale. As they sailed from port to port, they carried not just goods but ideas. The alphabet spread wherever they traded, adapted by each culture but maintaining its essential structure. Their religious concepts influenced Greek mythology, with Adonis from the Semitic Adon, Lord, becoming a Greek god, and Europa, possibly from the Semitic Ereb, sunset or west, becoming the name of a continent. Their purple dye became the symbol of royalty from Rome to Persia. Their ship designs were copied from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Their commercial practices became the foundation of international trade law. The destruction of the Bronze Age had forced them to become something new, not subjects of empires but creators of networks, not defenders of territory, but spreaders of civilization. The phoenix had indeed risen from its ashes, and its wings would carry Canaanite culture to the ends of the earth. By the 10th century BC, Phoenician ships were venturing beyond the Mediterranean, establishing Cadiz on the Atlantic coast of Spain around 1100 BC. This wasn't just another trading post, but a gateway to new worlds. From Cadiz, Phoenician vessels sailed north to Britain for tin, south along the African coast for gold and ivory, possibly even circumnavigating Africa at the commission of Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, though this claim by Herodotus remains debated. The wealth generated by this expanded trade was enormous. Tyre, under kings like Hiram I, who allied with David and Solomon of Israel, became perhaps the richest city per capita in the ancient world. The prophet Ezekiel, even while condemning Tyre for its pride, couldn't help but marvel at its wealth. Your borders are in the heart of the seas. Fine linen, with embroidered work from Egypt, was your sail. Silver, iron, tin, and lead were bartered for your wares. Yet this wealth came with vulnerability. The Phoenician cities, focused on commerce rather than military might, were tempting targets for the new land empires emerging in the Iron Age. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, each would demand tribute, impose control, attempt to harness Phoenician wealth for imperial purposes. But like the phoenix, the Phoenicians proved impossible to permanently destroy. Conquer their homeland, and their colonies continued to thrive. Destroy their fleets, and they built new ones. Capture their cities, and they founded others. The colony ships. Dawn comes gentle to the harbour of Tyre in the 9th century BC, the sun painting the purple-dyed sails of departing vessels in shades of rose and gold. These are not trading ships making routine voyages, but colony ships, carrying entire communities to new lands, new possibilities, new futures. The preparation has taken months. Each ship carries not just people, but the seeds of civilization, carefully wrapped vine cuttings that will become vineyards, sealed jars of grain for planting, breeding pairs of chickens and goats, the tools necessary for every craft from pottery to metalworking. Most precious of all, each ship carries the sacred flame, kept burning in a specially designed bronze vessel that will light the first altar in the new settlement, maintaining the spiritual connection to the mother city. The passengers are a careful selection, young families with skills the colony will need, younger sons who will never inherit in Tyre, ambitious merchants seeking opportunities beyond the competitive markets of the homeland. There are priests to maintain religious traditions, scribes to keep records, soldiers to provide protection, craftsmen to build the new city. Each person has been chosen, their skills evaluated, their loyalty assessed. On the quayside, the farewells are bittersweet. Parents embrace children they may never see again. Siblings exchange gifts that will become family heirlooms. Friends make promises to maintain correspondence, though they know the letters will take months, perhaps years, to travel between the old home and the new. Yet there's excitement too, the intoxicating possibility of new beginnings, of land to claim, of fortunes to be made. As the ships clear the harbour, the passengers look back at Tyre one last time, its temples and palaces catching the morning light, the sound of its awakening markets carrying faintly across the water. Then they turn their faces forward, toward horizons that promise everything and guarantee nothing, carrying their culture like seeds that will take root in foreign soil and grow into something both familiar and strange. Carthage, daughter of Tyre, the story of Carthage's founding in 814 BC became one of the ancient world's great romantic tragedies, though the romance was likely added long after the fact. According to tradition, the city was established by Alyssa, called Dido by the Romans, a Tyrian princess fleeing the murderous intentions of her brother Pygmalion, who had killed her husband for his wealth. The story has all the elements of myth: exile, betrayal, clever negotiation, and tragic love when Aeneas arrives and departs. Yet beneath the myth lies historical truth. Carthage, Kart Hadasht, meaning new city in Phoenician, was indeed founded by Tyrian colonists in the late 9th century BC. Its location was chosen with the strategic brilliance that characterized Phoenician expansion, a promontory dominating the narrow waist of the Mediterranean, with excellent harbours, defensible positions, and access to the rich agricultural lands of North Africa. The early years were precarious. The colonists had to negotiate with local Libyan tribes for land, establish agricultural systems in unfamiliar soil, create governmental structures independent of but connected to Tyre. The famous story of Dido, purchasing only as much land as could be covered by an ox hide, then cutting the hide into thin strips to encompass an entire hill, may be myth, but it captures the cleverness and determination required to establish a foothold in hostile territory. What distinguished Carthage from other Phoenician colonies was its ambition to be more than a trading post. From the beginning, its founders envisioned a true city, a new Tyre that would eventually surpass its mother. They laid out streets in a grid pattern, built massive cisterns to store rainwater, constructed temples that rivaled those of the homeland. Within a century, Carthage was establishing its own colonies, creating a Western Phoenician empire that stretched from Sicily to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The relationship with Tyre remained complex. Carthage continued to send tribute to the mother city, particularly to the Temple of Melkart, Tyre's patron deity. Carthaginian nobles sent their children to Tyre for education, imported Tyrian craftsmen for major projects, maintained the old religious festivals and customs. Yet, increasingly, Carthage developed its own identity, influenced by its African location, its interaction with Greeks and indigenous peoples, its unique position between the eastern and western Mediterranean. The wealth of Carthage became legendary. Its merchants controlled the western Mediterranean's trade routes. Its agricultural estates produced enormous quantities of grain and wine. Its workshops produced goods that competed with the finest products of the East. The city developed new technologies, more efficient agricultural techniques that would later be documented by the Roman writer Margot, advanced metallurgy that produced superior weapons and tools, architectural innovations like the famous circular harbour with ship sheds that could accommodate over 200 vessels. Carthaginian exploration pushed the boundaries of the possible. Hanno the Navigator sailed down the West African coast, possibly reaching as far as Cameroon, encountering peoples and places no Mediterranean culture had seen before. Himilco sailed north to Britain and Ireland, establishing trade routes for tin and other valuable resources. These voyages weren't just commercial ventures, but deliberate attempts to find new worlds, new opportunities, new horizons for Phoenician culture. The political system Carthage developed was unique in the ancient world, a complex balance between aristocratic and democratic elements that Aristotle would later praise as one of the best designed constitutions he had studied. Two annually elected magistrates called Sophides, from the same root as the Hebrew shophet, judge, provided executive leadership. A council of elders, drawn from the wealthy merchant families, provided continuity and experience. A popular assembly had the final say on major decisions, creating a system of checks and balances that prevented any single faction from dominating. This political sophistication extended to international relations. Carthage developed a network of treaties and alliances that created stability in the Western Mediterranean for centuries. The treaty with Rome, signed in 509 BC, preserved by the historian Polybius, shows remarkable diplomatic sophistication, delineating spheres of influence, establishing commercial protocols, creating dispute resolution mechanisms. For over 2 centuries, this treaty and its successors maintained peace between the two powers. The military innovations of Carthage would become legendary, while the Phoenicians of the East had relied primarily on naval power and mercenary armies. Carthage developed combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, cavalry, and most famously, war elephants. The elephants, imported from the forests of North Africa, served not just as weapons, but as psychological tools, terrifying enemies who had never encountered such beasts. The image of Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants would become one of history's most enduring military images. Yet, for all its power and sophistication, Carthage carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Its reliance on mercenary armies created loyalty problems in times of crisis. Its commercial focus made it vulnerable to powers that prioritized military conquest. Its position between Africa and Europe, which had been its strength, became a vulnerability when Rome emerged as a Mediterranean power. The Punic Wars that followed would determine not just the fate of Carthage, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The Wandering Merchant. You are Hasdrubal the Merchant, though that's not the name your mother gave you 37 years ago in Sidon. You've had many names in many ports, each suited to the local tongue, each carrying its own set of relationships, debts, and possibilities. Today, walking through the marketplace of Massalia on the coast of Gaul, you are simply another foreign trader, your Phoenician origins evident in your curled beard and the particular way you examine goods, running them through your fingers, while your mind calculates profits in 3 different currencies. Your ship waits in the harbour, a modest vessel by Phoenician standards, but still superior to anything the locals can build. Its hold contains amphorae of wine from Cyprus, sealed with wax impressed with your personal mark, a tiny ship that serves as both signature and advertisement. You also carry bolts of cloth dyed, the particular shade of blue that these Gauls prize, somewhere between sky and sea, achieved through a mixture of woad and indigo that took years to perfect. The local merchants watch you with a mixture of suspicion and eagerness. You represent both opportunity and threat, access to goods they cannot otherwise obtain, but also competition for their own products. You've learned to navigate this delicate balance, never showing too much wealth lest you become a target, never appearing too humble lest they think you can be cheated. In your belt pouch, wrapped in oiled leather, you carry your most valuable possession, a small tablet with columns of numbers and symbols, your record of debts owed and credits earned in ports from Carthage to Cornwall. No one else can read it. The script, a personalized variant of the Phoenician alphabet, the numbers in a code your father taught you. This tablet represents a fortune in future transactions, relationships built over decades, trust earned through countless honest dealings. You speak 6 languages fluently and can make yourself understood in a dozen more. In each, you know not just the words for commercial transactions, but the stories people tell their children, the names of their gods, the proper way to compliment a man's wife without giving offence. This knowledge, accumulated over 20 years of sailing and trading, is worth more than any cargo in your ship's hold. Tonight you will dine with the Greek merchant who controls much of Massalia's eastern trade. You will drink his wine, praise his hospitality, listen to his complaints about Roman expansion. You will share selected news from other ports, careful to provide valuable information without revealing anything that might compromise your own advantages. And at the evening's end, you will negotiate a deal that will profit both of you, because you learned long ago that the best transactions are those where everyone benefits. Tomorrow you will sail west, toward the Pillars of Hercules and beyond, to the tin mines of the far north, where the locals paint themselves blue and practice strange rituals at circles of standing stones. You will trade your wine and cloth for ingots of tin that, alloyed with Cypriote copper, will become bronze weapons and tools in forges from Carthage to Tyre. Each transaction is a link in a chain that connects the entire known world, and you, Hasdrubal, or whatever name you choose to use, are one of the vital links that keeps civilization itself functioning. Gods in new garments. The Phoenician gods didn't die when their cities burned. They simply changed their names and continued their immortal existence under new management. This transformation wasn't violent theological conquest, but something more subtle, a process of translation and adaptation that saw Canaanite deities taking on new roles in foreign pantheons while maintaining their essential characteristics. The Greeks were perhaps the most enthusiastic adopters of Phoenician religious concepts. Adonis, the beautiful youth beloved by Aphrodite, whose death and resurrection marked the changing seasons, was simply the Semitic Adon. Lord, a title of Baal. The Greeks adopted not just the god, but the entire ritual complex surrounding him. The gardens of Adonis, quickly sprouting plants that died just as fast, symbolizing the brevity of life. The mourning ceremonies where women wept for the dead god, the joy of his return that coincided with the spring rains. Europa, the Phoenician princess abducted by Zeus in the form of a bull, gave her name to an entire continent. Whether she was originally a goddess or a mythologized historical figure remains debated, but her story preserves memories of Phoenician influence on Greek culture. The bull that carries her away is reminiscent of El, the Canaanite high god, often depicted as a bull, while her brother Cadmus, who searches for her, is credited with bringing the alphabet to Greece. Even Aphrodite herself, that most Greek of goddesses, shows clear Near Eastern origins. Her emergence from sea foam mirrors the birth of Phoenician Astarte from the primordial waters. Her association with doves, her role as patron of sailors, her connection to sacred prostitution, all echo Phoenician religious practices. The Greeks acknowledged this connection, calling her Aphrodite Urania, heavenly Aphrodite, distinguishing her Near Eastern aspect from her more humanized Greek personality. The Roman adaptation was even more systematic. They encountered Phoenician religion primarily through Carthage, and they found in it elements that resonated with their own religious concepts. The Carthaginian practice of sacred vows, where individuals pledged specific actions in exchange for divine favor, mapped perfectly onto Roman religious law. The Punic deities were simply given Latin names and incorporated into the Roman pantheon, though often with a certain suspicion that reflected the bitter wars between Rome and Carthage. The influence extended beyond the classical world. As Phoenician traders reached the Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa, they carried religious concepts that would blend with local traditions in ways that can still be detected. The Celtic goddess Brigantia shows similarities to Astarte in her role as a protector of high places and patron of crafts. The Iberian sanctuaries, where bulls were sacrificed, echo Canaanite practices that associated the bull with divine power. Perhaps most significantly, Phoenician religious concepts influenced the development of monotheism. The Hebrew Bible preserves evidence of this complex relationship, simultaneously condemning Canaanite religion while adopting its imagery. The biblical God splits the sea like Baal splitting Yam, rides on clouds like Baal the storm god, judges from a divine council like El in Canaanite mythology. The very architecture of Solomon's temple, built with the help of Phoenician craftsmen, followed Phoenician religious architectural principles. This religious influence wasn't one-directional. As Phoenicians encountered other religious traditions, they incorporated new elements into their own practices. In Carthage, the Libyan goddess Tanit became coupled with Baal Hammon, creating a unique theological synthesis. In Cyprus, Phoenician Astarte merged with the local goddess to create a deity that was neither purely Phoenician nor purely Cypriot, but something new. The legacy of this religious transmission extends to our own time. When Christians speak of resurrection, when Muslims face toward a sacred stone, when any Western religion uses alphabetic texts to preserve divine revelation, they are participating in traditions that passed through Phoenician hands, were shaped by Phoenician concepts, were spread by Phoenician ships sailing to the ends of the earth. The blind poet's memory, his name was Homer, or perhaps that was just what later generations called him. In the 8th century BC, he sat in the court of a minor king on the island of Chios, his unseeing eyes turned toward a window he couldn't see, listening to a Phoenician merchant tell stories of the Great War at Troy. The merchant, who had come to trade purple cloth for the excellent wine Chios produced, had heard the stories in Sidon from an Egyptian priest, who had heard them from a Hittite scribe, who claimed his grandfather had been there when the great city fell. Homer had heard versions of these stories before, sung by other wandering poets, each with their own variations, their own emphases. But the Phoenicians' version contained details the others lacked: the exact construction of ships, the proper names of winds, the specific goods that merchants valued. These weren't the observations of landlocked poets, but of people who had actually sailed the wine-dark sea, who knew the terror of storms and the joy of safe harbours. "Tell me about the ships," Homer said, and the merchant, pleased to find an appreciative audience, described vessels that could carry 50 men, their black hulls sealed with pitch, their eyes painted on the prow to see through darkness. He spoke of navigation by stars, of reading omens in the flight of birds, of the particular sound wind makes in rigging just before a storm strikes. The merchant had brought with him a small piece of papyrus covered with those strange Phoenician letters that could capture sound itself. "This," he said, placing it in Homer's hands so he could feel the texture, "is how we remember, not through memory alone, but through marks that speak." Homer ran his fingers across the surface, feeling the slight indentations where ink had soaked into fibres, imagining what it would be like to preserve words forever, to free them from the fallibility of human memory. That night, as Homer composed new verses for his great poem about Achilles' rage, he wove in what the merchant had told him. The catalogue of ships became more precise, the descriptions of sailing more accurate, the geography of the wine-dark sea more real. He kept the mythic elements, the gods and heroes his audience expected, but grounded them in a reality borrowed from Phoenician experience. Years later, when Homer's poems were finally written down using the Greek alphabet adapted from Phoenician script, they preserved not just Greek legends, but Phoenician knowledge. Every time someone reads about Odysseus sailing past the Pillars of Hercules, they're reading geography learned from Phoenician explorers. Every time they encounter descriptions of purple cloth worth its weight in silver, they're seeing the world through Phoenician eyes. The blind poet never saw the sea he described so vividly, but through Phoenician words, he sailed every part of it. Silent stones, speaking. In the ruins of ancient Byblos, exposed by winter rains in 1923, archaeologists discover a sarcophagus that will revolutionize understanding of alphabetic writing. The limestone has been carved with exquisite care, depicting the deceased king seated at a banquet table, surrounded by symbols of power and plenty. But it's not the imagery that makes hearts race. It's the inscription running along the edge. Clear Phoenician letters, spelling out a warning to grave robbers and a blessing for those who respect the dead. The el-Amarna sarcophagus, as it comes to be known, bears the earliest known extensive Phoenician inscription, dating to around 1000 BC. Each letter stands distinct, evolved from those first scratches in Sinai mines, but now confident, standardized, official. Coffin which Ithobal, son of Ahiram, king of Byblos, made for Ahiram his father when he placed him in the house of eternity. In museums across the world, Phoenician artifacts speak their silent testimony. A bronze bowl from Cyprus, decorated with concentric circles of imagery. Egyptian pharaohs receiving tribute, Assyrian warriors in battle, Greek heroes fighting monsters, all surrounded by a Phoenician inscription claiming credit for its creation. An ivory plaque from Nimrud showing a woman at a window, her face carved with such delicacy that you can almost see her breathing. A glass bead no bigger than a fingernail, its colours swirled in patterns that wouldn't be replicated for another 1,000 years. Each object carries stories within stories. The technical knowledge required for its creation, the trade networks that brought raw materials from distant lands, the aesthetic choices that reveal what Phoenicians considered beautiful, the wear patterns that show how these objects were used, treasured, passed down through generations until they found their way into tombs or treasury rooms or the buried ruins of burned cities. In the quiet galleries where these objects rest, visitors pause without quite knowing why. Something about these artifacts speaks across millennia, a direct connection to hands that shaped them, eyes that admired them, hearts that mourned when they were buried with the dead. The silence of stones that have outlasted their creators, their cities, their entire civilization, yet still managed to speak. The alphabet's children, from the original 22 letters of the Phoenician alphabet, have grown scripts that carry the thoughts of billions, like a family tree whose branches spread until they cover the earth. Each adaptation preserves something of its parent, while developing unique characteristics suited to new languages, new cultures, new ways of thinking. The Greeks made the first major modification around 800 BC, adding vowels by repurposing Phoenician letters for sounds Greek didn't possess. Aleph, the glottal stop, became alpha, the vowel A. He, a Semitic H sound, became epsilon, E. This innovation made the alphabet fully phonetic, capable of representing any word in any language, though the Greeks kept the Semitic names and order of letters, preserving their Phoenician heritage even as they claim to have improved upon it. From Greek came the script of Europe. The Etruscans borrowed the Greek alphabet, modifying it for their mysterious language. The Romans took it from the Etruscans, streamlining it into the letters you're reading now. As Rome's empire expanded, the Latin alphabet spread to peoples who had never heard of Phoenicians, carrying with it concepts of law, administration, literature that depended on widespread literacy. Eastward, the Aramaic script, derived directly from Phoenician, became the administrative language of the Persian Empire. From Aramaic developed the square Hebrew letters used for biblical texts, preserving Phoenician letter forms in sacred contexts. The Nabatean adaptation of Aramaic evolved into Arabic script, its flowing curves suited to rapid writing, spreading with Islam from Spain to Indonesia. The Brahmi script of India, whose exact relationship to Phoenician remains debated, shows suspicious similarities in both form and sequence, whether borrowed directly through trade contacts or developed independently along similar principles. It became the ancestor of scripts throughout South and Southeast Asia. Sanskrit, Thai, Tibetan, all preserve echoes of those original 22 signs. Each adaptation reveals cultural priorities. Latin capitals maintain the monumental quality suitable for carved inscriptions proclaiming Roman power. Arabic developed a cursive form that could capture the rhythms of poetry and the precision of mathematics. Chinese scholars, encountering alphabetic scripts through Buddhist texts, chose to maintain their logographic system, but developed phonetic annotations using simplified characters, creating a hybrid system that preserves both meaning and sound. The digital age has given the alphabet new life and new challenges. Unicode attempts to encode every script derived from the Phoenician alphabet, plus every other writing system humans have developed, creating a vast family reunion of scripts in digital space. Emojis represent a return to pictographic communication, yet they're organized and accessed through alphabetic interfaces. Modern linguists can trace the genealogy of letters, like geneticists tracing DNA. The letter A begins as an ox head in Proto-Sinaitic, becomes the triangular aleph of Phoenician, rotates to become the Greek alpha, streamlines into the Roman A, and eventually becomes the simplified A of modern fonts. Each transformation preserves something essential while adapting to new needs, new technologies, new ways of making meaning visible. In every text message sent, every tweet composed, every search query entered, the ghost of Phoenician innovation persists. The very concept that human speech can be broken into discrete sounds, and those sounds represented by arbitrary but consistent symbols, remains as revolutionary today as it was 3,000 years ago. Every child learning to read, struggling to connect letters to sounds to meaning, recapitulates the cognitive revolution that began in ancient Canaan. In the museum's twilight, you stand in the Phoenician gallery of the Louvre as the afternoon fades toward evening, the filtered light giving everything a golden cast that seems appropriate for artifacts from the Bronze Age. The tourists have mostly departed, leaving you alone with 3,000 years of accumulated beauty and function. The ivory plaque before you, no larger than a playing card, draws you in with its impossible detail. A woman peers from a balustraded window, her face turned 3/4 toward you, a slight smile playing at her lips. Her hair is elaborately arranged, each curl carved with a precision that seems impossible given the tools available. You lean closer, careful not to breathe on the glass, and see that her eyes have been inlaid with some darker material, giving them depth, making them seem to follow you as you move. The museum label provides basic information: woman at the window, ivory, 8th century BC, probably from Arslan Tash, Syria, but it cannot convey what you feel looking at this piece. The sudden collapse of temporal distance, the recognition that the hand that carved this knew exactly what it was doing, had practiced for years to achieve this level of skill, took pride in work that would outlast empires. You move to a case containing jewellery, earrings of gold granulation, so fine that individual spheres are barely visible to the naked eye, a necklace of glass beads that alternate between deep blue and swirls of white and yellow that look like tiny galaxies, a ring whose seal shows a scarab beetle surrounded by hieroglyphs, but carved in a distinctly Phoenician style. Someone wore these pieces, someone felt their weight, admired their beauty, perhaps received them as a wedding gift or inheritance, treasured them enough that they were placed in a tomb to accompany their owner into eternity. The sarcophagus of Eshmunazar II dominates one wall, its black basalt surface covered in Phoenician text that the museum has translated: I, Eshmunazar, king of the Sidonians, son of Tabnit, king of the Sidonians, grandson of Eshmunazar, king of the Sidonians, lie in this coffin. The repetition feels like an incantation, an attempt to preserve identity beyond death through the sheer force of naming. A small clay tablet catches your eye, unremarkable, except for the fact that it's covered in alphabetic script, one of the earliest examples. You can make out some letters that look almost familiar, ancestors of the letters you use every day. This mundane object, probably a merchant's inventory or contract, represents one of humanity's greatest innovations. Someone pressed these marks into wet clay on an ordinary day 3 millennia ago, never imagining that their routine record-keeping was participating in a revolution that would change the world. As closing time approaches, and a guard politely indicates you should move toward the exit, you take one last look at the gallery. These objects, torn from their contexts, separated from their creators by an unbridgeable gulf of time, nonetheless speak. They say, we were here, we created beauty, we solved problems, we loved and feared, and hoped just as you do. The Phoenicians may have vanished, but their hands still shape our world, echoes in sacred texts. The Hebrew Bible, that foundational text of Western religion, cannot escape the shadow of Phoenician influence, even as it condemns Canaanite religion with fierce consistency. The relationship is complex, antagonistic, yet intimate, like estranged siblings who share too much history to ever truly separate. When Solomon decides to build the temple in Jerusalem, he turns to Hiram of Tyre for expertise. The biblical account preserves remarkable details. Phoenician craftsmen cast the bronze pillars called Jachin and Boaz, their capitals decorated with pomegranates and lilies, in distinctly Phoenician style. The cherubim that guard the Holy of Holies follow Phoenician iconographic traditions. The very layout of the temple, its progression from outer court to holy place to most holy place, mirrors Phoenician temple architecture found from Tyre to Carthage. The Psalms, those ancient songs of praise and lamentation, show clear borrowing from Canaanite poetic traditions. Psalm 29 appears to be a Canaanite hymn to Baal barely modified for Yahwistic worship. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The parallel structure, the imagery of divine voice as thunder, the association with cosmic waters, all echo the Baal cycle discovered at Ugarit. Even in condemnation, the biblical texts preserve Phoenician memory. When Ezekiel prophesies against Tyre, his oracle contains such specific details about Tyrian trade that it serves as one of our best sources for understanding Phoenician commerce. He lists their trading partners, their products, their routes, creating an economic geography more comprehensive than any Phoenician source that survives. The Book of Kings preserves the memory of Jezebel, the Phoenician princess who married Ahab of Israel and became the biblical archetype of the wicked foreign woman. Yet reading between the lines of condemnation, we see a woman trying to maintain her religious traditions in a foreign land, supporting prophets of Baal and Asherah, just as her husband supported prophets of Yahweh. Her crime was not apostasy, but diversity, not abandoning gods, but adding them. The influence flows in multiple directions. Phoenician inscriptions from the Persian period show awareness of Jewish theology, sometimes invoking the God of heaven in language that echoes biblical phrases. The Phoenician colonies in North Africa preserve traditions about their origins that parallel biblical narratives about exodus and divinely guided migration. The Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice to Moloch, a deity mentioned with horror in biblical texts, suggesting shared religious heritage, diverging into different practices. The New Testament continues this complex relationship. Jesus travels to the region of Tyre and Sidon, encounters a Syro-Phoenician woman whose faith he praises. Paul sails on Phoenician ships, stays with Phoenician converts, carries the Christian message through trade networks established by Phoenician merchants centuries earlier. The purple seller Lydia, Paul's first European convert, practices a trade that was quintessentially Phoenician. In the Quran, the people of Thamud and Ad, destroyed for their refusal to acknowledge God, may preserve memories of Phoenician trading cities that Islamic tradition encountered. The emphasis on maritime trade, on divine judgment through economic catastrophe, on the transience of commercial wealth, echoes themes that would have resonated in Phoenician ports. These religious texts, attempting to establish monotheistic purity, cannot escape the polytheistic, cosmopolitan, commercially sophisticated world the Phoenicians created. Every condemnation acknowledges influence, every prohibition suggests temptation, every prophetic oracle against Tyre or Sidon confirms their importance. The Phoenicians may have lost the religious argument, but their ghosts haunt the texts of those who claimed victory. The geneticist's discovery. Dr. Sarah Chen stares at the computer screen in her Oxford laboratory, the genetic data resolving into patterns that tell a story written in DNA. She's been tracing mitochondrial haplogroups through Mediterranean populations, looking for signatures of ancient migrations, and what she's found challenges conventional historical narratives. The data shows clear Phoenician genetic markers, particularly the male Y chromosome lineage called J2, spreading from the Levant to every location where ancient sources place Phoenician colonies. But it's not just present. In some locations, it represents a significant percentage of the modern population. In Malta, nearly a third of the population carries markers that trace back to Phoenician settlers. In Sardinia, isolated villages preserve genetic signatures that have remained virtually unchanged for 3,000 years. What surprises her most is the pattern of distribution. The genetic markers don't spread gradually, like you'd expect from general population movement. Instead, they appear in specific locations, mostly coastal, mostly at sites of known Phoenician settlement, maintaining their distinctiveness despite 3 millennia of subsequent history. It's as if the Phoenician colonies created genetic islands that, while not completely isolated, maintained enough separation to preserve their ancestral signatures. She cross-references with her colleague in Beirut, who's been studying modern Lebanese populations. Despite centuries of conquest, migration, and conversion, despite the complete transformation of language and religion, about 30% of modern Lebanese carry genetic markers that link them directly to the ancient Canaanites. The Phoenicians never really disappeared. They just stopped calling themselves Phoenicians. Her phone rings. It's her collaborator in Tunisia calling about the Carthaginian data. The genetic patterns there are even more complex, showing not just Phoenician markers, but their specific mixing with North African populations, creating a unique genetic signature that persists in modern Tunisians. They can actually track the difference between areas of heavy Phoenician settlement and indigenous Berber regions, the genetic boundaries still visible after more than 2,000 years. She thinks about what this means for identity, for history, for the stories we tell about vanished civilizations. Somewhere in Lebanon, Tunisia, Malta, Spain, a person carrying groceries home from the market bears in their cells the legacy of purple merchants and alphabet inventors. They may not know it, may have no cultural connection to their Phoenician ancestors, but the connection exists nonetheless. Written in the 4 letters of DNA, just as their ancestors wrote in 22 letters of alphabet. The data suggests something else intriguing. The Phoenician genetic spread shows significantly more male than female lineages in most locations, suggesting that male merchants and colonists married local women. But in a few places, particularly in religious centres, female lineages also appear, possibly indicating that priestesses of Astarte travelled with colonising expeditions, maintaining religious traditions that required female leadership. As she prepares her paper for publication, Dr. Chen reflects on the irony that the Phoenicians, who invented the alphabet that makes historical memory possible, left so few written records of themselves. Yet they wrote their history in something more permanent than papyrus or clay. They wrote it in the genetic code of their descendants, a text that required 3,000 years, and the invention of DNA sequencing to read. Stars over Lebanon, the stars above the Lebanese mountains, shine with the same cold light that guided Phoenician sailors 3,000 years ago. The constellation they called the Bear, that the Greeks would name the Phoenician constellation in their honour, wheels slowly around the pole star, marking time in its ancient, inexorable way. In the ruins of Baalbek, the great stones of the temple platform, some weighing over 1,000 tons, lie exactly as Roman engineers placed them atop foundations that were already ancient when Rome was founded. The precision of their fitting, the ambition of their scale, speaks to a continuity of engineering knowledge passed from Canaanite to Phoenician to Roman hands. The cedars of Lebanon, those few remaining groves that escaped the axes of empire builders, stand like sentinels of deep time. Their wood built Solomon's temple, Phoenician ships, Egyptian barges, Roman siege engines. Now they're protected. Tourists come to photograph them, but they're shadows of the forests that once covered these mountains like green snow that gave the Phoenicians their first great trade commodity that started them on the path to becoming the merchants of the ancient world. Down in the valley, the lights of modern Beirut glitter like fallen stars. This city that has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that archaeologists struggle to separate the layers. Phoenician, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Crusader, Ottoman, French, modern Lebanese, each building atop the ruins of the last, each claiming to be the true heirs of this ancient land. The night wind carries the smell of the sea, salt and seaweed, and that indefinable scent of vast water in motion. The same smell that meant home to returning Phoenician sailors, that meant danger to their enemies, that meant possibility to young Phoenicians setting out to establish new colonies in unknown lands. Somewhere in the darkness, waves wash against the remains of ancient harbours, their stones worn smooth by centuries of tides. The purple murex snails still cling to the rocks, though no one harvests them anymore. The eternal traders. In the souks of modern Tripoli, in the markets of Tunis, in the commercial districts of Malta, the ghost of Phoenician commerce persists. Not in the goods sold, though sometimes those too, but in the very structure of trade, the assumptions about how business should be conducted, the deep cultural patterns that outlast the civilizations that created them. The concept of the trusted middleman, essential to Phoenician success, remains central to Mediterranean commerce. The idea that a merchant's reputation is worth more than any single transaction, that business relationships should span generations, that a deal isn't complete until both parties benefit. These Phoenician innovations still govern trade from Beirut to Barcelona. The Phoenician practice of standardized weights and measures, their development of credit systems that allowed payment in one port for goods delivered in another, their creation of commercial law that transcended national boundaries, all persist in modern international trade. When a letter of credit issued in Dubai is honoured in London, when shipping containers are standardized to fit any port in the world, when commercial arbitration resolves disputes without reference to national courts, we're using systems whose principles the Phoenicians pioneered. Modern Lebanon, despite centuries of disruption, maintains a commercial diaspora that mirrors ancient Phoenician patterns. Lebanese merchants in Lagos, Sao Paulo, Sydney maintain connections to their homeland while fully integrating into their adopted countries. They fund hospitals in their ancestral villages while building businesses in their new homes. They preserve cultural traditions while adapting to local customs. They are, in essence, doing exactly what Phoenician merchants did 3,000 years ago. The free ports and special economic zones that drive modern global commerce follow models the Phoenicians invented. Tyre and Sidon were among the first cities to understand that reducing barriers to trade, providing secure storage for goods in transit, allowing merchants to operate under their own legal systems, he would generate wealth that more than compensated for lost customs revenues. Modern Singapore, Dubai, Hong Kong are essentially Phoenician city-states, small territories that leverage geographic position and commercial sophistication to prosper far beyond what their natural resources would suggest. Even the controversial aspects of Phoenician commerce find modern parallels. Their willingness to trade with anyone, regardless of political or religious differences, their prioritization of profit over principle, their role as enablers of other powers' ambitions, all resonate in contemporary debates about globalization, corporate responsibility, the ethics of international trade. The alphabet they spread made contracts possible, accounts keepable, correspondence maintainable. Every email sent to confirm a transaction, every digital signature on an electronic contract, every spreadsheet calculating profit margins, uses tools whose basic concept, the representation of language in transmittable form, the Phoenicians gave to the world. As global supply chains stretch around the world, as containers move from factory to consumer through networks of staggering complexity, as financial instruments allow the separation of ownership from physical possession. We're living in a world the Phoenicians would recognize, would understand, would know how to navigate. They are the eternal traders, not because their civilization endured, but because they invented patterns of commerce that transcended their own existence. Where purple meets the horizon, the sun sets over the Mediterranean, painting the waters in shades of purple that recall the color that made Phoenician fortune. It's an ending that's also a beginning, the close of one day that promises another, the eternal cycle that governs seas and civilizations alike. The Phoenicians left no great monuments like the pyramids, no vast literature like the Greeks, no conquering legacy like Rome. What they left was more subtle and more pervasive, the tools that made all other achievements possible. They gave us the alphabet that let Homer write his epics, that let Roman law be codified, that let sacred texts be preserved. They created the commercial networks that carried not just goods, but ideas, technologies, artistic styles, religious concepts. They demonstrated that small nations could influence history, not through military might, but through innovation, adaptation, connection. Their cities are ruins now, some buried under modern constructions, others worn down to foundations, stones, still others completely lost. Their locations matters of scholarly debate. Carthage is a suburb of Tunis. Tyre is a small Lebanese city that tourists rarely visit. Sidon struggles with the challenges of modern Lebanon. The great harbours that welcomed ships from the ends of the earth are silted up, their ancient moorings visible only at exceptionally low tides. Yet every child learning the alphabet, every merchant calculating profit, every sailor navigating by stars, every person wearing purple as a sign of status, participates in Phoenician legacy. They achieved a kind of immortality that conquerors with their statues and monuments never managed. They became essential to the operating system of civilization itself, so integrated into how we conduct human affairs that we forget they had inventors, had origins, had a specific time and place where someone first thought to do things differently. In the museum cases, their artifacts speak of a people who found beauty in function, who valued craftsmanship over size, who understood that true power came not from controlling territory, but from connecting it. The ivory carvings that decorated their furniture, the glass vessels that held their perfumes, the metalwork that armed their soldiers and adorned their temples, all speak to a civilization that valued quality over quantity, skill over scale. The genetic studies tell us they never really disappeared. Their descendants walk the streets of Beirut and Tunis, Malta and Cadiz, carrying in their cells the inheritance of purple merchants and alphabet inventors. They may speak Arabic or Spanish or Maltese rather than Phoenician. They may pray to Allah or Christ rather than Baal and Asherah, but something persists, some continuity of presence that connects the ancient world to our own. As darkness finally claims the Mediterranean, the stars emerge, the same stars the Phoenicians steered by, arranged in the same patterns they used to find their way across trackless waters. The North Star, which they taught the Greeks to navigate by, still holds its place, still offers direction to those who know how to read the sky. May these historical reflections have brought you comfort and calm. The Phoenicians remind us that influence isn't always about power, that small can be mighty, that innovation can outlast empire. They whispered their alphabet into the ears of history, and that whisper became the voice of civilization itself. Their purple may have faded, their ships may have rotted, their cities may have fallen, but their greatest gift, the democratization of writing, the connection of cultures through commerce, the demonstration that creativity can triumph over force, endures. In the gentle rhythm of waves against ancient stones, in the whispered stories of vanished merchants, in the quiet persistence of letters that outlived their creators, find your own passage to sleep. The Phoenicians sailed into history's sunset 3,000 years ago. But the purple glow of their passage still colours our horizon, still lights our way, still reminds us that what we create with wisdom and share with generosity can outlive empires and overcome oblivion. May the tranquil flow of time carry you to peaceful rest.